They say rejection kills you twice. First when it happens, then every morning after when you wake up and remember you're still breathing. But here's what they don't tell you about being cast out by the one man who is supposed to claim you as his own. It doesn't break you. It births something else entirely, something that doesn't beg, doesn't plead, doesn't forgive. So buckle up, because what you're about to witness isn't a fairy tale. It's a reckoning. And if you want to see how a woman erased from history rewrites the ending, you better stick around till the very last word. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is still out there listening. The grand hall stank of expectation. Not the pleasant kind. The suffocating kind that pressed against Lysera's ribs like a fist wrapped around her lungs. She stood at the center of the marble floor, surrounded by 300 faces she'd known her entire life, and not a single one looked at her with anything resembling warmth. They were waiting. The court, the pack elders, the lesser alphas who'd gathered from across the territories to witness what should have been the most sacred moment of her existence. Her claiming. The chandeliers above blazed with enough candlelight to make the whole damn room feel like it was on fire. And maybe it was. Maybe she was standing in the middle of her own funeral pyre and just didn't know it yet. Lysera's fingers trembled at her sides. She hated that, hated the weakness of it, but her body didn't care about her pride. It knew what was coming even if her mind refused to accept it. Across from her, elevated on the dais where the throne sat like a monument to everything she'd never be allowed to touch, stood Vaelor Draxen, Alpha King, her destined mate, the man who was supposed to look at her and see his future. He wasn't looking at her at all. His eyes, cold and gray as winter stone, fixed somewhere past her left shoulder, like she was a stain on the wall he'd rather not acknowledge. His jaw was set hard, the muscle there jumping with barely contained tension, and his hands, those hands that were supposed to reach for her tonight, remained locked behind his back. Lysera's chest tightened. Something was wrong. She'd known it the moment she'd walked into the hall and felt the silence drop like a guillotine blade. No cheers, no welcoming howls, just that awful, choking quiet that made every breath feel like theft. The High Elder stepped forward, his robe sweeping the marble with a whisper that somehow cut through the stillness. His face was ancient, carved from disappointment and duty in equal measure. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall. Not loud, just inevitable. Lysera Vale, daughter of the Outer Territories, Omega of the Southwestern Pack, you have been summoned to stand before your Alpha King for the sacred rite of claiming. Her throat closed. This was it. This was the moment every Omega dreamed of from the time they could understand what destiny meant. The moment when the bond snapped into place, when two souls recognized each other across the void and said, yes, this is mine, this is home. Lysera had spent 23 years believing in this moment, believing she was meant for something more than the dusty borderlands where she'd grown up, more than the pitying looks and the whispered concerns about whether she'd ever be chosen at all. And then Vaelor had arrived 6 months ago, touring the Outer Territories like some kind of god descending from the clouds. And when his eyes had landed on her across a crowded market square, something had sparked. She'd felt it. She'd sworn she'd felt it. The pull. The recognition. That primal click of rightness that the old stories promised would be undeniable. He'd sent for her the next day, summoned her to the capital, told her to prepare for the claiming ceremony, and she'd believed. Stupid girl. Alpha King Vaelor Draxen, the High Elder continued, turning toward the dais. Do you accept this Omega as your destined mate? Do you claim her before the gathered court and bind yourself to her for the duration of your reign? The silence that followed could have swallowed the world. Lysera's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack through bone and expose itself to the room. Her palms were slick with sweat, her knees locked to keep from shaking. Vaelor's gaze finally shifted to her, and in that moment, Lysera understood what it meant to be seen and found wanting. His lip curled, just slightly, just enough. No. The word landed like a blade between her ribs. No, he repeated, louder this time, his voice ringing through the hall with the kind of certainty that could topple mountains. I do not claim her. I reject this bond. I reject this Omega. She is insufficient, unworthy, a mistake. The hall erupted, not with shock, with agreement. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd like a disease spreading. Heads nodded, eyes gleamed with vindication. They'd known. They'd all known. This wasn't a ceremony. It was an execution. Lysera's vision blurred at the edges. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that didn't seem to pull in any oxygen. The floor tilted beneath her feet, and for one horrible second she thought she might actually fall, might actually collapse right here in front of everyone and prove them all right. But she didn't. Her legs held, barely. "You told me," she said, and her voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. "You sent for me. You said—" "I said nothing," Valor cut her off, his tone flat and brutal as a hammer to the skull. "You assumed. You, like every desperate Omega from the outer wastes, saw what you wanted to see, but I looked closer, and what I found was deficiency." The word hit her like a slap. Deficiency. "You are weak," he continued, descending the steps of the dais now, moving toward her with the kind of predatory grace that should have made her run. "Your bloodline is diluted. Your instincts are compromised. You lack the strength, the purity, the dominance required to stand beside a king. You would produce weak heirs. You would weaken the throne. And I will not allow that." Each word was a nail driven into the coffin of everything she'd believed about herself. Lysera's hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms hard enough to draw blood. "I am not weak," she forced out, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Valor stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could smell the cold, clean scent of him. Close enough that the bond she'd thought was forming screamed in agony at his proximity and his rejection in the same breath. "You are exactly as weak as you appear," he said softly, and somehow that was worse than the shouting. "And the mercy I show you now is this. I will not kill you for wasting my time. I will simply erase you." He turned to the High Elder. "Remove her name from the records. Strip her of rank and territorial claim. She is no longer Omega. She is nothing." The High Elder bowed. "It will be done, Alpha King." "Wait," Lysera's voice cracked. "You can't." "I can do anything I want," Valor said without looking at her. "I am the Alpha King, and you are already forgotten." He walked away. Just turned his back on her and walked away like she was less than dirt beneath his boots. The crowd began to disperse, conversations picking up, laughter even, as if they'd just witnessed some mildly entertaining theater and not the complete destruction of a woman's entire existence. Lysera stood there, alone in the center of the emptying hall. Her mind was white noise, static, a high-pitched ringing that drowned out everything except the singular, undeniable truth that her life as she knew it had just ended. No bond, no future, no name, nothing. A hand gripped her elbow, rough and unyielding. One of the guards. "Move," he grunted. She didn't resist as he dragged her toward the side exit. What was the point? Where would she even go? What would she even do? They shoved her into a small antechamber, bare stone walls and a single barred window that let in the faint glow of moonlight. "You'll be escorted to the outer territories at dawn," the guard said. "Don't try anything stupid." The door slammed shut. The lock clicked. And Lysera was alone. Truly, devastatingly alone. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold stone wall, and for the first time in her life she let herself break. Not with sobs, not with tears. With silence. A silence so profound it felt like suffocation, because crying required the belief that someone might hear you, and there was no one left. Hours passed, maybe days. Time lost meaning in that little room. Lysera sat in the dark and let her mind dismantle itself piece by piece. Every memory, every moment of hope, every stupid, naive belief she'd clung to about her place in the world, all of it turned to ash in the wake of Valor's words. Deficient, weak, unworthy. The words looped in her head like a curse, and the worst part? A small, traitorous part of her wondered if he was right. Because how else did you explain this? How else did you make sense of being chosen, and then unchosen? Of feeling a bond that apparently didn't exist? Maybe she was broken. Maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with her that she'd been too blind to see. Maybe... No. The thought cut through the spiral like a knife. No. Lysera's eyes snapped open in the dark. Her hands, which had been limp and useless in her lap, slowly curled into fists again. Because here was the thing about breaking. Here was the thing no one told you. When you shatter completely, when every piece of who you thought you were scatters across the floor, you get to choose what you rebuild. And Lysera was done choosing weakness. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking but holding. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, pale, hollow-eyed. A ghost of the girl who'd walked into that hall. Good. Let that girl die. She'd served her purpose. What rose in her place didn't need a name, didn't need approval, didn't need a God's damned alpha king to tell her what she was worth. The door opened with the dawn. 2 guards entered, one of them holding shackles. "Put these on," he ordered. Lysera looked at the chains, looked at him. "No," she said quietly. The guard blinked. "What?" "I said no. You want me gone? Fine. I'll walk out of here on my own feet, but I won't wear chains for you." Something flickered in the guard's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. Or the faint recognition that the woman standing in front of him wasn't the same one they'd locked up the night before. He glanced at his companion, who shrugged. "Fine," the first guard muttered, lowering the shackles. "But you try anything." "I won't," Lysera said. "I have no reason to." Because what was there to fight for here? This place had made its judgment. Let them choke on it. They led her through the back corridors of the palace, away from the main halls where court was already in session. She caught glimpses through doorways, heard the murmur of voices, the scrape of chairs, the business of empire continuing as if nothing had happened, as if she'd never existed at all. Good. Let them forget. It would make what came next so much sweeter. The thought startled her. What came next? She didn't know, not yet. But for the first time since Valor had spoken that single, annihilating word, rejection, Lysera felt something other than despair. She felt curiosity. The guards deposited her outside the city gates with nothing but the clothes on her back and a skin of water one of them had the decency to toss at her feet. "Don't come back," he said. "There's nothing for you here." Lysera picked up the water skin, slung it over her shoulder, and looked back at the towering walls of the capital. "You're right," she said softly. "There isn't." She turned and started walking. South. Toward the outer territories. Toward the borderlands. Toward the places where the Empire's control frayed and the forgotten gathered in the shadows. And with every step, something inside her shifted. Hardened. Sharpened. Because here was the truth Valor didn't understand. Here was the thing he'd miscalculated. When you strip someone of everything, when you take their name, their future, their hope, you don't break them. You set them free. And freedom, Lysera was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous thing in the world. The outer territories greeted her like a slap to the face. Dust, heat, the kind of dry, relentless sun that baked the ground into cracked clay and turned the horizon into a shimmering lie. Lysera had grown up here, but she'd left young enough that most of her memories were softened by distance. She'd remembered it as harsh, yes, but survivable. She'd forgotten how much it hated you. By the 3rd day of walking, her lips were split and bleeding. Her skin was burned raw despite the makeshift hood she'd fashioned from part of her dress. The water skin was nearly empty, and she hadn't seen another living soul since leaving the capital's shadow. Good. She didn't want company. Company meant questions. Pity. The kind of concerned looks that made you feel like a victim. And Lysera was done being a victim. On the 4th day, she found the settlement. Or rather, it found her. She'd collapsed under a dead tree, her body finally giving out after miles of forcing one foot in front of the other. The world had gone gray at the edges, her vision tunneling down to nothing, and she'd thought distantly that maybe this was it. Maybe she'd burned through her anger already, and this was where the story ended. In the dirt. Alone. Forgotten. Exactly like they'd wanted. The voice cut through the haze. "You dead or just stupid?" Lysera's eyes cracked open. A woman stood over her, backlit by the brutal sun, her face hidden in shadow. But her voice was rough as gravel, edged with something that might have been amusement. "Both," Lysera croaked. The woman snorted. "Fair enough." Strong hands gripped her arms, hauling her upright with a strength that should have been impossible for someone her size. The woman was small, wiry, built like a blade, and when Lysera finally focused on her face, she saw scars, lots of them. "Can you walk?" the woman asked. "Do I have a choice?" "Not really. You stay here, you die. You come with me, you might die. But at least you'll die with water in your belly." "Compelling offer," Lysera muttered, but she forced her legs to move. The woman half dragged, half carried her across the wasteland to a cluster of structures that generously called themselves buildings. Scrap metal, salvaged wood, canvas stretched across frames that looked like they'd collapse in a strong wind. But inside one of them, blessedly, was shade and water. The woman thrust a cup at her. "Slow! You chug it, you'll puke." Lysera sipped, the liquid like heaven against her shredded throat, and studied her savior. Mid-30s, maybe. Hard to tell with faces that had seen too much sun and too many fights. Dark hair cropped short, eyes the color of amber, sharp and assessing. "Got a name?" the woman asked. Lysera hesitated. Her name had been stripped, erased. But that didn't mean she couldn't choose a new one. "Lys," she said finally, close enough to remember, different enough to matter. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Just Lys? Just Lys? All right, just Lys. I'm Kara. Welcome to the ass end of nowhere. Try not to die on my floor, it's a pain to clean." Despite everything, Lysera felt her mouth twitch. Almost a smile. "I'll do my best, Mag." The settlement, Lysera learned over the next few days, was called Haven. The name was ironic. There was nothing safe about it. It was a collection of outcasts, rogues, and abandoned pack members who'd either run from the Empire or been thrown out of it. People with no allegiance, no alpha, no structure beyond basic survival. They should have torn each other apart. Instead, they'd built something, not a pack. Packs required hierarchy, submission, the kind of rigid roles that Lysera had spent her whole life suffocating under. This was different. This was collaboration born from necessity. You pulled your weight or you left. Simple, brutal, honest. Lysera liked it immediately. Kara ran the place, though she'd punch anyone who called her a leader. She organized supply runs, mediated disputes, and kept the peace through a combination of sharp wit and sharper fists. "You want to stay, you work," she told Lysera on the 5th day. "I don't care what you did before. I don't care who you were. Out here, you're what you prove." "What do you need?" Lysera asked. Kara studied her for a long moment. "You know how to fight?" "No." "Hunt?" "No." "Cook? Build? Track?" "No." Kara sighed. "What can you do?" Lysera thought about it. 23 years in the outer territories, trained for one purpose: to be an Omega, to be soft, nurturing, supportive, to be everything she'd failed at. "I can learn," she said finally. Kara's eyes narrowed, then she grinned. "All right, just Lys, let's see if that's true." Shake. Learning hurt. Every God's damn day of it. Kara started her with basic combat, which meant getting her ass handed to her repeatedly by a woman half her size who moved like water and hit like stone. "Stop thinking," Kara snapped after Lysera went down for the 10th time that morning. "Your body knows what to do. Your brain's just in the way." "My brain's trying to keep me alive," Lysera gasped from the dirt. "Yeah? How's that working out?" Lysera glared up at her, sweat dripping into her eyes, every muscle screaming. And then she moved. Not thinking, just reacting. Her leg swept out, catching Kara behind the knee. The smaller woman stumbled, and Lysera used the momentum to roll, to rise, to actually land a hit for the first time in 3 weeks of training. It wasn't much, just a glancing blow to Kara's shoulder. But Kara's grin widened. "There you go. That's the start." The thing about survival, Lysera discovered, was that it didn't care about your feelings, didn't care if you were tired, didn't care if you were scared, didn't care if every bone in your body screamed for rest. You adapted, or you died. So she adapted. She learned to move without sound through the scrubland, learned to track water by reading the flight patterns of birds, learned which plants would save you and which would kill you within hours. And she learned to fight, Not like the trained soldiers in the capital with their formal stances and predictable patterns, but like someone with nothing to lose. Dirty, desperate, effective. "You're getting better," Kara admitted one evening as they sat around the communal fire, nursing bruises and passing a skin of something that burned going down. "I'm getting meaner," Lysera corrected. Kara laughed. "Same thing out here." Lysera took another drink, letting the burn settle in her chest, and stared into the flames. 6 months. 6 months since the rejection. 6 months since she'd been erased. And for the first time since that night in the grand hall, she felt like she could breathe. Not because the pain was gone, but because she'd learned to carry it differently. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. Kara glanced at her. "Shoot. Why did you help me? That first day. You didn't know me, didn't owe me anything." Kara was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "Because I've been where you were," she said finally. Not the same situation, but the same look. That look of someone who just got hollowed out and doesn't know if they want to keep breathing or just stop. "What did you choose?" Kara's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I chose spite. Figured the best revenge was staying alive just to piss off everyone who wanted me gone." Lysera felt something fierce and bright flare in her chest. "I like that," she said softly. "Yeah," Kara said. "Me too." Chat. The runner arrived on a day so hot the air shimmered with malice. He came from the west, riding hard, his horse lathered and exhausted. Kara met him at the edge of Haven, and Lysera, curious, followed. The runner dismounted, swaying on his feet. "Need water," he rasped. "And information. There's a pact forming, couple days west. They're calling themselves the Unchained." Kara's expression didn't change. So they're recruiting. Anyone who's been cast out. Anyone who's got a grudge against the Empire. They're saying it's time to push back. Lysera's pulse kicked up. "Who's leading them?" Kara asked. The runner shook his head. "Don't know, but whoever it is, they're smart, organized. They took a supply convoy 3 weeks ago without a single casualty. Just walked in, talked the guards into standing down, and walked out with everything." Kara's eyes narrowed. "Talked them into it?" "That's what I heard." Lysera's mind was racing. An organized resistance, not through violence, through persuasion, through strategy. "Where exactly?" she asked. The runner looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Whatever he saw made him hesitate. "Why?" he asked carefully. "Because I want to meet them," Lysera said. Kara turned to her, one eyebrow raised. "You thinking of leaving?" "I'm thinking of learning," Lysera said. "You taught me how to fight, how to survive. But that?" She nodded at the runner. "That's something else. That's how you build power without permission." Kara studied her for a long, silent moment. Then she grinned. "You're not the same girl who collapsed under that tree, are you?" "No," Lysera said quietly. "I'm not." "Good." Kara clapped her on the shoulder. "Go, learn, and when you come back you better teach me what you find." "If I come back," Lysera thought. But she didn't say it out loud. The Unchained's camp was exactly what she expected and nothing like it at the same time. Organized chaos. Tents arranged in a defensive perimeter. Sentries posted at intervals. A command structure that wasn't hierarchy but function. People doing what they were good at without someone standing over them barking orders. Lysera walked in alone, hands visible, weapons left behind. She was stopped twice before she reached the center. Both times she said the same thing. "I'm here to learn." The third person who stopped her was different, older, scarred, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "Learn what?" he asked. "How you did it," Lysera said. "How you took that convoy without bloodshed. How you convinced trained soldiers to just walk away." The man's mouth twitched. "You really want to know?" "Yes." He studied her, then nodded. "Follow me." He led her to a tent larger than the others, and inside, surrounded by maps and reports and a dozen people arguing over strategy, stood a woman. Not an alpha, not an omega, just a woman. But the way everyone in that tent deferred to her, the way they listened when she spoke, told Lysera everything she needed to know about real power. The woman looked up as they entered, and her gaze locked onto Lysera with the precision of a blade. "Who's this?" she asked. "Says she wants to learn," the scarred man replied. The woman's eyes didn't leave Lysera's face. "Learn what?" Lysera met her stare without flinching. "How to burn an empire from the inside out." The tent went silent. Then the woman smiled. Not cruel, not kind, just knowing. "Then you're in the right place," she said. "Welcome to the Unchained. My name's Marin, and if you're serious about this, you're going to wish you'd stayed in whatever hole you crawled out of." Lysera felt something click into place. Not a bond, not destiny, just certainty. "Try me," she said. Marin didn't coddle. She didn't explain. She threw Lysera into the deep end and watched to see if she'd sink or swim. The first week was observation. Lysera sat in on meetings, watched negotiations, saw how Marin dismantled opposition not through force, but through understanding what people wanted, and showing them how cooperation served them better than conflict. It was manipulation, but it was also truth. Because Marin never lied. She just reframed reality until the obvious choice was the one she needed. "Power isn't about being the strongest," Marin said one night as they sat alone, reviewing supply routes. "It's about being the most necessary. Make yourself indispensable, and people will protect you without being asked." Lysera absorbed it all. Every word, every tactic, every lesson in how to read people, how to find their pressure points, how to turn potential enemies into reluctant allies. And slowly, she began to apply it. There was a dispute in the camp, two groups fighting over water rights. Marin watched Lysera handle it. She didn't pick a side. She showed them how sharing the resource and coordinating access would benefit both groups more than hoarding it. It worked. "Not bad," Marin said afterward. "But you hesitated. Why?" "I was afraid of being wrong," Lysera admitted. "Then you'll fail," Marin said bluntly. "Confidence isn't about being right. It's about making people believe you are, even when you're not." It should have sounded cynical. Instead, it sounded like survival. 3 months with the Unchained, and Lysera barely recognized herself. The girl who'd stood in the grand hall, begging with her eyes for acceptance, was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, someone who understood that power wasn't given, it was taken. And not through violence, through strategy. She was sitting with Marin, planning a recruitment run to the eastern settlements, when the messenger arrived. He was young, panicked. "Soldiers!" he gasped. "Empire soldiers! A full battalion! They're headed this way!" The camp erupted into controlled chaos, people grabbing weapons, preparing defenses. Marin's face was stone. "How long?" she asked. 2 days, maybe less. Lysera's mind was already moving, already calculating. "We can't fight them," she said. "No shit," Marin muttered. "So we leave." "And let them destroy everything we've built?" Lysera looked at her. "What have we built? Tents? Supplies? Those are replaceable. What matters is the people, the idea. Let them take the camp. Let them think they've won. And while they're congratulating themselves, we regroup, rebuild, somewhere they won't find us." Marin stared at her. Then she started laughing. "Gods, you're ruthless." "I learned from the best," Lysera said. They evacuated before dawn, took everything they could carry, and burned the rest. When the Empire soldiers arrived 2 days later, they found nothing but ash and empty tents. No enemy to fight. No victory to claim. Just the slow, creeping realization that they'd been outmaneuvered. And in the hills 3 miles away, Lysera watched the smoke rise and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But the beginning of it. Because Valor had taught her one thing in that throne room. He'd taught her that power built on fear was fragile. And she was learning how to crack foundations, one careful, calculated blow at a time. Word spread fast in the outer territories. The Unchained had evaded an Imperial battalion without a fight. More than that, they'd made the Empire look foolish, and people noticed. Lysera watched the camp swell over the next months, new faces every week, people who'd heard the stories and wanted in, not because they loved the Unchained, but because they hated the Empire more. And that, Lysera was learning, was enough. Hate was a currency she could work with. Marin put her in charge of integration, making sure the new recruits understood what they were joining, what was expected, what would get them killed. It was a test. Lysera knew that. Marin was watching to see if she could lead, so she led. Not through dominance, not through force, but through clarity. She laid out the truth without sugarcoating it. "This isn't a rebellion," she told a group of new arrivals one evening. "Not yet. This is survival with teeth. You stay, you work, you contribute, and you get protection. You cause problems, you leave. It's that simple." A man in the back, broad-shouldered and scarred, spoke up. "And what happens when the Empire comes back? Because they will." Lysera met his eyes. "Then we do what we did before. We move. We adapt. We survive. Because that's what they can't do. They're locked into one way of thinking, one way of fighting, and that makes them predictable." "You sound pretty confident for someone who's never actually fought a war," the man said. Lysera's smile was cold. "You're right, I haven't, but I've been on the receiving end of their judgment. I know exactly how they think, and that's going to be their downfall." The man held her gaze for another beat, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'm in." 6 more months passed. The Unchained weren't a camp anymore. They were a network, spread across the outer territories in small, mobile cells that could communicate, coordinate, and disappear when necessary. Marin's idea. But Lysera had helped refine it, and somewhere in the process of building this thing, this movement, Lysera realized she'd stopped thinking about Veilor, not because the wound had healed, but because she'd found something that mattered more than revenge. She'd found purpose. And then the letter arrived. It came with a merchant caravan passing through, sealed with wax that bore the imperial crest. Marin handed it to her without a word. Lysera stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside, written in precise, elegant script, was a single paragraph. To the woman calling herself Lys, "Your activities have not gone unnoticed. The Empire is aware of your movement, aware of your influence, and aware that you were once known by another name. Return to the capital, submit to judgment, or watch everything you've built burn. You have 30 days. Veilor Draxon, Alpha King." Lysera read it twice. Then she handed it to Marin. Marin's face went hard. "What do you want to do?" Lysera looked at the letter again, at the threat barely disguised as mercy, and she felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not anger. Certainty. "I want to go back," she said quietly. Marin blinked. "What?" "Not to submit, not to beg, but to show him what he created when he threw me away." Marin's eyes narrowed. "You realize this is probably a trap." "Of course it is," Lysera said. "But here's the thing about traps. They only work if you're afraid of them, and I'm not afraid anymore." "Then what are you?" Lysera folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her belt. "Ready?" she said. And somewhere deep in the capital, in a throne room that still carried the ghost of her humiliation, Veilor Draxon had no idea that the woman he'd erased was about to rewrite the entire game. One move at a time. The journey back to the capital took 12 days. Lysera didn't rush. She moved deliberately, stopping at settlements along the way, talking to people, listening to their grievances, their fears, the quiet desperation that came from living under a rule that demanded everything and gave back nothing but the promise of order. She wasn't recruiting, not yet. She was mapping. Understanding the landscape of resentment that Veilor had cultivated without even realizing it. Because here's what tyrants never understand. Fear works until it doesn't. Until the cost of submission outweighs the cost of resistance. And Veilor, in his obsession with purity and strength and absolute control, had pushed too hard for too long. The Empire was a powder keg. Lysera was just the match. Marin had wanted to send an escort, a show of force to prove Lysera wasn't coming back broken. Lysera had refused. This wasn't about posturing. This was about walking into the lion's den and making the lion blink first. And you didn't do that with backup. You did it alone. On the 11th day, she reached the outer ring of the capital, where the grand estates gave way to smaller holdings, where minor nobility clutched their titles like drowning men clutching driftwood. She stopped at an inn, paid for a room with the last of her coin, and spent the night staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario of what tomorrow would bring. Valor expected submission or defiance. Both reactions he knew how to handle. Submission, he'd crush with contempt. Defiance, he'd crush with force. So Lysera would give him neither. She'd give him something he'd never encountered before. Indifference. Not to him, to his authority. Because the opposite of love isn't hate. It's irrelevance. And she was about to make Valor Draxen realize that his power only existed because people agreed to acknowledge it. What happened when someone stopped agreeing? That was the question she was going to answer. What? The palace gates stood exactly as she remembered them. Tall, imposing, designed to make anyone approaching feel small. Lysera walked up to them like she was coming home from the market. The guards stepped forward, hands on weapons. One of them, a young man with a face too fresh for the hardness he was trying to project, spoke first. "What's your business?" Lysera looked at him. Through him, really, like he was a mildly interesting obstacle. "I'm here to see the king," she said. The guards exchanged glances. The second one, older, scarred, spoke with the weary patience of someone who dealt with 1,000 delusional petitioners. "The Alpha King doesn't see walk-ins. You need an appointment, a petition. Sponsorship from—" "I don't need any of that," Lysera interrupted. "He sent for me. I'm here." She pulled the letter from her belt and held it up. The older guard took it, read it, and his expression shifted. Not to respect, to unease. "Wait here," he muttered, and disappeared inside. Lysera waited. The young guard watched her like she might explode at any moment. "You really think he's going to see you?" he asked, trying for casual and landing somewhere around nervous. Lysera smiled. No teeth, just a curve of her mouth that didn't reach her eyes. "I know he will," she said, "because I'm the one thing he can't ignore. A mistake that won't stay buried." The young guard opened his mouth, closed it, decided silence was safer. Smart kid. The older guard returned 10 minutes later and his face had gone carefully blank. "You're to be escorted to the throne room immediately." Lysera nodded. "Lead the way." They walked through corridors she remembered from nightmares, marble floors, tapestries depicting glorious battles and righteous kings. The architecture of empire designed to remind you at every turn that you were small and the throne was vast. She'd been terrified of these halls once. Now they just looked like expensive decorations. The throne room doors swung open, and there he was. Valor Draxen, Alpha King, the man who'd rejected her, the man who'd tried to erase her, sitting on his throne like a monument to his own mythology. He looked the same, cold, carved from stone and certainty, his gray eyes fixed on her with the kind of focus that was meant to pin you in place, make you squirm, make you remember your place in the hierarchy. Lysera met his gaze and felt nothing. No pull, no phantom bond, just a man on a chair. The court was packed. Every noble, every sycophant, every minor alpha who'd crawled out of the woodwork to witness whatever spectacle Valor had planned. They wanted a show. Fine. She'd give them one. "Lysera Vale," Valor said, and his voice carried through the hall with practiced authority. "Or should I say, Lyse, since you seem to have discarded the name I stripped from you." Lysera stopped in the center of the room, the exact spot where she'd stood 18 months ago. Different woman now, different rules. "I discarded nothing," she said, her voice calm, conversational. "You tried to take my name, my identity, my future, and I let you think it worked, because it was easier to build something new when you all thought I was gone." Valor's jaw tightened, a hairline fracture in his composure. "You received my letter," he said. "I did. And yet you stand here unarmed, unescorted. Either you're suicidal or monumentally arrogant." Lysera tilted her head. "Or I understand something you don't. Enlighten me." "You think power is about strength," she said, "about dominance, about making people submit through fear. And that works. For a while. But fear is exhausting. It requires constant reinforcement, constant displays of force. The moment you stop reminding people why they should be afraid, they start remembering why they're angry." Valor leaned forward slightly. "And you think you've made them angry?" "I haven't done anything," Lysera said. "You did." Every harsh edict, every public execution, every time you demanded absolute loyalty and gave nothing back but the privilege of not being destroyed. You built this empire on the belief that strength equals right. And now people are starting to ask a very dangerous question. What question? Lysera smiled. What happens when someone stronger comes along? The throne room went silent. You cannot be serious, Valor said, and for the first time there was something in his voice that wasn't quite control. Are you challenging me? No, Lysera said. I'm telling you I don't have to, because you've already lost. You just haven't realized it yet. Valor rose from the throne. The movement was smooth, controlled, but there was violence coiled beneath it, the promise of what he could do if she pushed him far enough. Here's what's going to happen, he said, descending the steps toward her. You're going to kneel. You're going to apologize for the disruption you've caused, and then you're going to publicly swear loyalty to the throne. Do that, and I'll allow you to live. And if I don't, then I'll make an example of you that will echo through every settlement in the outer territories. I'll show them what happens to those who forget their place. He was 3 feet away now, close enough that she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands flexed like he was imagining them around her throat. Lysera didn't move. You still don't understand, she said quietly. You can kill me, torture me, make whatever example you want, but it won't matter, because the idea is already out there. The proof that someone can walk away from your authority and not only survive, but thrive. You can't kill an idea, Valor. You can only prove it right. Something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the first shadow of doubt. And Lysera pressed the advantage. Here's what I think happened, she said. I think you rejected me because you saw something that scared you, not weakness, but the potential for something you couldn't control. An Omega who didn't fit the mold, who didn't submit easily, who asked questions instead of just accepting. And you couldn't have that, because your entire rule is built on the idea that everyone has their place and stays in it. So you got rid of the variable. Valor's face had gone very still. But what you didn't account for, Lysera continued, was what happens when that variable stops playing by your rules. When it goes out into the world and shows other people that the hierarchy isn't natural, it's enforced. And enforcement requires consent. The moment people stop consenting, the whole thing collapses. Enough, Valor said, his voice low and dangerous. You want me to kneel? Lysera asked. You want submission? Then give me a reason. Not fear, not threats, but an actual reason why your rule is better than what I'm building. Show me why people should follow you instead of choosing their own path. I don't have to justify myself to you, Valor snarled. No, Lysera agreed. You don't. But you do have to justify yourself to them. She gestured to the court, to the nobles watching with carefully neutral expressions, to the guards standing at attention, hands on weapons, eyes flickering between their king and the woman who wouldn't kneel. Because every single person in this room is doing the same math right now, Lysera said. They're wondering what happens if they stop being afraid. What happens if they realize that you need them more than they need you, and the longer you stand here trying to make me submit, the more time they have to think about it. Valor's hand shot out, gripping her throat. Not squeezing, not yet, just holding, a display of dominance, a reminder of physical superiority. Lysera didn't fight it. She just looked at him. And spoke anyway, her voice rough but clear. Proving my point. For a long frozen moment, they stood there. King and outcast. Alpha and the woman who refused to be Omega. Then Valor released her and stepped back. His face was a mask, but his eyes betrayed him. He was rattled. Take her to the holding cells, he said to the guards. I'll decide her fate after I've consulted with the council. It was a retreat. Disguised as authority, but a retreat nonetheless. And everyone in that room knew it. The cell was nicer than the one she'd been thrown in 18 months ago. Stone walls, a cot, a barred window that actually let in light, almost civilized. Lysera sat on the cot and waited. She knew what was coming. Valor wouldn't execute her publicly, not yet. That would make her a martyr. Give the movement a face to rally around. No, he'd try something else first. He'd try to break her privately. Strip away the defiance and then parade her broken submission in front of the court. Standard playbook. The door opened 3 hours later. Not guards. Valor himself. alone. Lysera raised an eyebrow. Brave. Or stupid. He closed the door behind him, and for the first time since she'd walked into the throne room, she saw him without the performance. Just a man. Tired. Angry. And underneath it all, uncertain. "What are you really doing here?" he asked. His voice was different, quieter. The royal command stripped away, leaving something raw. "I told you," Lysera said. "I came because you asked." "Bullshit. You came to undermine me, to make me look weak in front of my own court." "You did that yourself," Lysera said, "the moment you let me see that I got under your skin." Valor's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You want to know the truth?" he said. "The real reason I rejected you?" Lysera waited. "Because when I looked at you," he said, his voice low and taut as a wire about to snap, "I saw someone who would never truly submit, who would always question, always push. And I couldn't have that. A king needs stability, certainty, not an omega who acts like an equal." "There it is," Lysera said softly. "The truth you've been avoiding. You didn't reject me because I was weak. You rejected me because I wasn't weak enough." Valor's jaw clenched. "You think you've won something here, that you've proven a point, but all you've done is paint a target on yourself and everyone connected to you." "Maybe," Lysera said, "but at least I'm honest about what I am. Can you say the same? What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you sit on that throne and tell yourself you rule because you're the strongest, the most deserving. But deep down, you know the truth. You rule because people are too scared to stop you. And the second that fear breaks, everything you've built crumbles. That's what terrifies you about me. Not that I'm a threat, but that I'm proof that fear isn't enough." Valor stared at her, and something in his expression shifted, not softening, but cracking. "You could have been beside me," he said, and there was something almost like regret in his voice. "If you just accepted your role. If you'd just been what I needed you to be." "I was never going to be that," Lysera said. "And somewhere in your gut you knew it. That's why you threw me away. Not to protect the throne, to protect yourself from having to face what you really are. A man so afraid of losing control that he destroys anything that might challenge him." "I am not afraid," Valor said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lysera stood, moving closer to the bars separating them. "Then prove it," she said. "Let me go. Right now. No conditions, no threats. Just let me walk out of here and go back to the outer territories. If you're really as secure in your power as you claim, one woman shouldn't threaten you." Valor's eyes narrowed. "And if I don't, then you prove that everything I said in that throne room was true. That you rule through fear, not respect. And everyone watching this little drama will know it." For a long moment, Valor said nothing. Then he turned and walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. "You want a war?" he said without looking back. "You'll get one. And when it's over, I'll make sure your name is forgotten for real this time." He left. The door slammed shut, and Lysera let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, because she'd just done the impossible. She'd made the Alpha King doubt himself. And doubt, once planted, grew like poison. They released her at dawn. No explanation. Just a guard opening the cell and jerking his head toward the door. "You're free to go. King's orders." Lysera didn't question it. She walked out of the palace the same way she'd walked in, alone, unbowed. But something had changed. The guards at the gate watched her differently, not with contempt, but with something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect. Word had spread. The woman who'd stood in the throne room and refused to kneel. The woman the king couldn't break. She was halfway to the outer ring when she realized she was being followed. Not guards, something subtler. Lysera ducked into an alley, pressed herself against the wall, and waited. The footsteps approached, hesitated. Then a voice, young and uncertain, called out, "I know you're there. I'm not here to hurt you." Lysera stepped out. The young guard from the gate stood in the mouth of the alley, hands raised, no weapon visible. "What do you want?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "To ask you something." "Go ahead." "Is it true? What you said in the throne room, that we don't have to be afraid?" Lysera studied him. Barely 20. Still had that idealistic shine in his eyes that life hadn't beaten out of him yet. "You tell me," she said. "Are you asking because you want permission? Or because you already know the answer and just need someone to say it out loud? The guard's throat worked. I've seen things. Orders I didn't agree with. People hurt for no reason except that someone had to be made an example. And I keep thinking, this isn't what I signed up for. But everyone says that's just how it is. That order requires sacrifice. Order, Lysera said, requires consent. The moment it requires sacrifice from people who didn't agree to it, it stops being order and starts being tyranny. And tyranny always falls eventually. The only question is how much damage it does on the way down. The guard nodded slowly. What are you going to do? What I've been doing, Lysera said. Show people there's another way. Not through violence, not through chaos, but through choice. Let them decide for themselves what kind of world they want to live in. And if the king tries to stop you, Lysera's smile was sharp as broken glass. Then he'll learn the same lesson I did. That power built on fear is fragile, and I'm very good at finding cracks. The guard held her gaze for another moment. Then he stepped aside. Good luck, he said quietly. Lysera walked past him, back into the street, and didn't look back. But she knew. She knew that conversation was going to repeat itself 100 times. 1,000. In barracks and kitchens and guard posts across the empire. Because doubt, once seated, spread like wildfire, and she'd just lit the match. Marin was waiting at the rendezvous point, 3 days' ride south of the capital. She took one look at Lysera and grinned. You're alive, and you look way too smug for someone who just walked into the dragon's mouth. I didn't just walk in, Lysera said. I made him question whether he's still a dragon at all. Marin's grin widened. Tell me everything. Lysera did. Every word. Every moment. The confrontation in the throne room. The private meeting in the cell. The guard in the alley. By the time she finished, Marin was shaking her head in disbelief. You're insane, she said. You know that, right? You went into his stronghold and basically told him his entire worldview is bullshit. Yes. And he let you live. Yes. Marin let out a low whistle. He's more rattled than I thought. He's afraid, Lysera said. Not of me specifically, but of what I represent. The idea that his authority is conditional, that it exists only as long as people agree to it. And once people start questioning that agreement, everything falls apart, Marin finished. So what's next? We double down, Lysera said. We show every settlement, every outcast, every person who's ever been told they're worthless, that they have a choice. Not through rebellion, not through violence, but through refusal to participate in a system that grinds them down. We build an alternative so compelling that people choose it over the empire, not because we force them, but because it's better. Marin studied her for a long moment. You've changed. When you came to Haven, you were angry, hurt, running from something. Now you're running towards something. I know what I want now, Lysera said. Not revenge, not validation, just the chance to prove that power doesn't have to be a hierarchy, that people can organize themselves without someone standing over them with a whip. And if Valor comes after us? Because he will. Then we do what we've always done, Lysera said. We adapt. We move. We survive. And we show him that you can't crush an idea with force. You can only make it stronger. Marin clapped her on the shoulder. All right, revolutionary, let's get back to work. The next 6 months unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Lysera didn't attack the empire. She undermined it. Small things at first. Merchants who'd been squeezed by imperial taxes suddenly found alternative trade routes that bypassed the official checkpoints. Routes organized by the Unchained, where goods flowed freely and no one took a cut. Soldiers stationed in remote outposts started receiving letters. Not threats, just questions. Why are you here? What are you protecting? Is it worth it? Some threw the letters away, but some didn't, and slowly desertions began. Not in mass numbers, but enough to notice, enough to worry. Meanwhile, settlements that had been struggling under imperial quotas found themselves suddenly supported by the Unchained network. Food, supplies, protection from bandits, all given freely. No demands for loyalty, no oaths of allegiance, just help. And people noticed. They noticed that the Unchained didn't rule. They collaborated. They noticed that you could say no and not be punished for it. They noticed that maybe, just maybe, the Empire's way wasn't the only way. Lysera coordinated it all from a dozen different locations, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. She'd learned strategy from Marin, but she'd added her own twist. She didn't just think 3 moves ahead, she thought about what the Empire would do and then made sure those responses worked in her favor. When Vaelor sent soldiers to crack down on a settlement suspected of harboring unchained sympathizers, Lysera made sure the settlement was empty by the time they arrived. But she also made sure the soldiers found evidence of imperial corruption. Supply manifests showing grain meant for the settlement diverted to the capital. Tax records altered to squeeze more from people who already had nothing. The soldiers returned to their commanders with questions. Questions led to doubt. Doubt led to fractures. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and it was working. The summons came 8 months after Lysera's first visit to the capital. Not a letter this time. An emissary. Official. Polite. But with steel underneath. The Alpha King requests your presence at a summit. Neutral ground to discuss terms. Lysera read the formal invitation, handwritten by Vaelor himself, and laughed. Terms, she said. He wants to negotiate. The emissary, a middle-aged man with the bearing of a career diplomat, inclined his head. The king recognizes that the current situation is untenable. He wishes to find a resolution that benefits all parties. Translation, he's losing and he knows it. Marin stood beside Lysera, arms crossed. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap, Lysera said. But it's also an opportunity. For what? To show everyone watching that I'm willing to talk, that I'm not the aggressor here. And when Vaelor inevitably shows his true colors, when he tries to assert dominance or make demands he has no right to make, it'll prove everything I've been saying. Marin's eyes narrowed. You're going to let him self-destruct in public. I'm going to give him the rope, Lysera said. What he does with it is up to him. She turned to the emissary. Tell the king I accept. Neutral ground. No guards beyond a small escort for each party. And it happens in a settlement, not a palace, somewhere the people can see what their leaders are really like. The emissary hesitated. That's irregular. Those are my terms, Lysera said. He wants to talk. We talk where it matters, not in some gilded room where he can control the narrative. The emissary bowed stiffly. I will relay your conditions. After he left, Marin turned to Lysera. You know he's going to try something. I'm counting on it, Lysera said. They chose a settlement called Greystone, neutral in the truest sense, not loyal to the Empire, not part of the Unchained network, just a place where people survived by staying out of conflicts they couldn't win. The perfect stage. Vaelor arrived with 20 guards. Lysera arrived with 5. The difference was noted. They met in the central square, a circular space paved with weathered stone, surrounded by buildings where residents watched from windows and doorways. An audience. Exactly what Lysera wanted. Vaelor stood across from her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked tired. Not weak, but worn, like a man who'd been fighting battles on too many fronts for too long. You wanted to talk, Lysera said. So talk. Vaelor's jaw tightened. This needs to end. Your movement, this disruption, it's tearing the Empire apart. Good, Lysera said simply. A ripple went through the watching crowd. Vaelor's eyes flashed. You would see everything collapse? All the stability, the order we've built? You built a prison and called it stability, Lysera said. You built control and called it order, and now people are remembering that they have a choice. There is no choice, Vaelor said, his voice rising. There's only chaos or civilization, and civilization requires hierarchy, requires people accepting their roles. Why? The question hung in the air like a blade. Vaelor blinked. What? Why does civilization require hierarchy? Lysera asked. Why does order require someone on top and someone on the bottom? Why can't people organize themselves based on skill and need instead of bloodline and force? Because they can't be trusted, Vaelor said. Left to their own devices, people descend into violence, into competition that destroys. Someone has to maintain order, and that someone is you. Yes. Why? Vaelor's composure cracked. Because I am the strongest. Because I earned this position. Because you were born into it, Lysera interrupted. You didn't earn anything, Violor. You inherited a throne built on centuries of other people's violence, and you've maintained it the same way, not through merit, through fear. I have kept this empire together, Valor snarled. I have prevented wars, maintained peace. You've maintained silence, Lysera corrected. There's a difference. Peace is when people choose to coexist. Silence is when they're too afraid to speak. And what you've built is very, very quiet. But it's not peace. Valor took a step forward. His guards tensed. So what's your solution? He demanded. Let everyone do whatever they want? Watch society crumble into factions fighting over scraps? My solution, Lysera said calmly, is to let people decide for themselves what kind of community they want. To give them the resources and protection they need to build it, and to prove that cooperation works better than domination. That's naive. It's working. Another ripple through the crowd, because it was true. Everyone there knew it was true. Valor's face had gone very still. Then he did exactly what Lysera knew he would do. He tried to reassert control the only way he knew how. Kneel, he said. Swear loyalty to the throne. End this movement, and I'll grant you clemency. I'll even give you a position. Advisor, help me reform the empire from within, but this ends now. Lysera looked at him and smiled. No, she said. Valor's hand went to the sword at his hip. Then you leave me no choice, he said. You always have a choice, Lysera said. You're just too afraid to make it. Valor drew the blade. The crowd gasped, and Lysera stood perfectly still, because this was the moment. This was the proof. The Alpha King, faced with an unarmed woman who refused to submit, resorting to violence. In front of everyone. Valor, one of his own guards said quietly. Not here. Valor's hand shook on the sword. His face was a mask of rage and something deeper, something that looked almost like desperation. You've already lost, Lysera said softly. The moment you drew that blade, you proved everything I've been saying, that your power is based on force, that you can't win an argument, so you silence opposition, and everyone here sees it now. Valor's eyes swept the crowd, saw the faces watching, saw the judgment, and something inside him broke. He lowered the sword. This isn't over, he said, his voice hoarse. No, Lysera agreed, it's just beginning. Valor turned and walked away. His guards followed, and Lysera stood in the center of Greystone, surrounded by people who'd just watched their king lose a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. The point of no return. Not for her. For him. Because Valor had just shown the Empire what happened when someone said no and lived to tell about it. And that knowledge, Lysera knew, would spread faster than any army could march. The Empire wasn't falling yet, but the cracks were showing. And cracks, given time and pressure, always widened into chasms. The victory at Greystone lasted exactly 4 days. 4 days of watching the story spread like wildfire through the outer territories. 4 days of new faces arriving at the Unchained camps, eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to hope. 4 days of Lysera allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work without the Empire burning to the ground. Then Meren disappeared. Not missing. Gone. Lysera knew the difference because Meren's tent had been stripped clean. Personal effects removed. Weapons taken. Even the maps they'd been working on, the ones showing supply routes and settlement contacts, vanished without a trace. Like she'd never been there at all. The others noticed too. Whispers started in the morning, turned to concerned murmurs by midday, and by evening the entire camp was on edge. Lysera stood in Meren's empty tent, her mind racing through possibilities she didn't want to entertain. Captured, killed, compromised. Or worse, the runner arrived at sunset. Same kid who'd brought news of the Unchained the first time, back when Lysera was still trying to figure out how to survive in Haven. He looked older now, harder, the kind of aging that happens when you see too much too fast. He handed Lysera a sealed envelope without meeting her eyes. From the capital, he said quietly. For you specifically. Lysera broke the seal. Inside, written in handwriting she recognized immediately as Violor's, was a single line. Your general sends her regards. If you want her back alive, come alone. The old fortress at Blackridge. 3 days. Underneath, in different handwriting, rougher and slanted, was a postscript. I'm sorry. Marin's hand. Lysera's blood went cold. The runner shifted his weight. There's more. Word spreading that Marin cut a deal with the king, that she gave up locations, names, supply routes. People are saying she sold you out. No, Lysera said immediately. That's impossible. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Because Marin had been the one who knew everything, every camp location, every contact, every weakness in their network. If someone wanted to destroy the Unchained from the inside, Marin was the perfect weapon. The runner's expression was pained. I'm just telling you what I heard, whether it's true or not. Lysera folded the letter carefully. Thank you. You can go. He hesitated. Are you going? I don't know yet. After he left, Lysera stood alone in the gathering darkness and felt the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders like a physical thing, because here was the calculation that kept rulers awake at night. One life versus many. Marin was her mentor, her friend, the person who'd pulled her from the dirt and taught her how to survive. But she was also a potential traitor who could unravel everything they'd built. And walking into Valor's trap alone could be exactly what he needed to decapitate the movement in one stroke. The smart choice was obvious. Write Marin off as a loss. Assume she'd broken under interrogation. Move the camps, change the routes, isolate the damage. Cold, calculated. Exactly what a leader should do. But Lysera had spent 18 months proving that she wasn't like other leaders. That loyalty mattered, that people weren't just pieces on a board to be sacrificed. And if she abandoned that now, what was she really building? Another empire, just with a different face at the top. The thought made her sick. She walked out of the tent and found the camp watching her, waiting for direction, for certainty. She gave them neither. I need to think, she said. Hold position. Don't do anything until I get back. Where are you going? One of them asked. To make a mistake, Lysera said. Maybe my last one. Mates. The ride to Blackridge took 2 days hard travel through terrain that seemed designed to kill anything stupid enough to cross it. Lysera went alone, not because Valor demanded it, but because bringing others would mean risking them too, and she'd already lost enough people. The fortress sat on a ridge overlooking a dead valley, all black stone in sharp angles. It had been abandoned for decades, too remote to be worth maintaining, too defensible to tear down. Perfect place for an ambush. Lysera approached at dawn, when the light was thin and gray and the shadows still clung to the walls like they were afraid of what daylight might reveal. The gate stood open. Another bad sign. She dismounted, left her horse tied to a dead tree, and walked through the entrance with her hands visible and empty. The courtyard was deserted except for a single figure standing in the center. Not Valor. Marin. She looked the same, scarred, compact, dangerous. But something in her eyes was different, broken, maybe. Or just resigned. Lysera stopped 10 feet away. Tell me it's not true, she said quietly. Marin's laugh was bitter. Which part? That I'm here? That I sold you out? That I've been working with Valor since before you even showed up at Haven? The words hit like physical blows. Lysera's vision narrowed. You're lying. I wish I was, Marin said. Would make this easier. From the shadows of the surrounding buildings, soldiers emerged. 20, 30, too many to fight, all armed, all positioned to cut off any escape. Lysera didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on Marin. Why? Marin's jaw tightened. Because I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. No, they really don't. Not when the alternative is watching everyone you care about die screaming. She gestured to the soldiers. Valor had my family, Marin said. My sister. Her kids. He took them 2 years ago. Told me I could work for him or watch them executed. So I worked. I built Haven. Created the Unchained. Made it look real. Made it feel real. Also, I could feed him information about who was dissenting, who was organizing, who needed to be quietly disappeared before they became a problem. Lysera felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything. Everything she'd learned. Everything she'd built. Based on a lie. But you taught me, she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. You showed me how to fight, how to think strategically. Why would you do that if— Because I liked you, Marin interrupted. And because somewhere along the way, I started believing the bullshit I was selling. Started thinking maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. That we could build something better. And then Valor reminded me what happens when I forget my place. She pulled back her sleeve. Fresh burns marred her forearm. Deliberate. Precise. The kind of pain designed to break will without destroying function. He had them tortured, Marin said flatly. My niece is 8 years old, and they made me listen over a communication crystal while she screamed. Then Valor told me I had one chance to make it stop. Bring you here. Alone. Or he starts sending me pieces of my family until there's nothing left to send. Lysera's hands curled into fists at her sides. Not from anger. From the awful, crushing understanding of what it meant to have no good options. Because she'd have done the same thing. Sacrificed anything, anyone, to save someone she loved. That's what power was. Not strength, not dominance. The willingness to hurt people to protect what mattered. And Valor understood that perfectly. Where is he? Lysera asked. Inside, Marin said. Waiting for you. And if I run, they kill my family. And they'll hunt you down anyway. This ends today, one way or another. Lysera looked at her mentor, her friend. The woman who'd saved her life and then spent 18 months building her into something dangerous. A tool. Unknowingly, maybe, but a tool nonetheless. The betrayal should have destroyed her. Instead, it clarified everything. Because here was the truth about power that no one wanted to admit. It was always built on coercion. Even the good kind. Even the kind that told itself it was different. The Unchained weren't free. They were just serving a different master. And Lysera had been too blind to see it. I'm going in, she said. Marin's face crumpled. I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. I know, Lysera said, and I forgive you. Because what else was there to do? Hate Marin for being human? For choosing family over ideology? That wasn't weakness. That was just the cost of caring about anything. Okay. The interior of the fortress was cold stone and echoing silence. Soldiers lined the corridors, but none of them moved to stop her. They just watched, like witnesses to an execution. Lysera climbed the stairs to what had once been the commander's hall. Her footsteps rang out too loud in the emptiness, each one a countdown to whatever waited at the top. Valor stood by the window, backlit by the rising sun. He didn't turn when she entered. You came, he said. You knew I would. Yes. Because despite everything, you still believe people matter more than strategy. That loyalty is worth dying for. It's admirable. And it's going to get you killed. Lysera moved into the room, keeping her distance but refusing to show fear. Let Marin's family go, she said. This is between us. Valor finally turned. He looked different than he had at Greystone. Less tired, more controlled, like he'd found his footing again. I don't think you're in a position to make demands, he said. I'm not making demands, Lysera said. I'm telling you what happens next. You let them go. You let Marin go. And then you and I settle this. Whatever you want. Trial, execution, public humiliation. I won't fight it, but they walk away clean. Valor studied her with something that might have been curiosity. You'd trade yourself for a traitor. And her family? She's not a traitor, Lysera said. She's a mother protecting her blood. That's not betrayal. That's survival. And you weaponized it because that's all you know how to do. Turn people's humanity against them. Valor's expression hardened. And you think you're different? You think your grand experiment in the Outer Territories was about humanity? You were building an army. Don't pretend otherwise. I was building a choice, Lysera corrected. There's a difference. There's really not, Valor said. You just dress it up prettier. But at the end of the day, you were gathering power, organizing resistance, preparing for conflict. The only difference between us is that I'm honest about what I am. You're still lying to yourself. The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. Lysera had told herself she was different, that she was offering freedom. But freedom without structure was chaos, and structure required someone to maintain it, which meant hierarchy, which meant power, which meant she'd been building exactly what she claimed to oppose. Just slower, more carefully, with better branding. The realization should have broken her. Instead, it sharpened her. Because Valor was right about one thing. She had been gathering power, and power, she was learning, was neither good nor evil. It was a tool. The morality came from how you used it. So maybe I am building an army, she said. Maybe you're right, and there's no such thing as pure freedom. Maybe every social structure requires someone to enforce it. But here's the difference between us. When people under my protection make mistakes, I don't torture their families. I don't turn their love into a weapon. I give them consequences. But I don't make them monsters. You give them consequences, Valor repeated, his tone mocking. And who decides what those consequences are? You. Which makes you exactly what I am, a ruler, with all the compromises and cruelties that come with it. You're just too naive to admit it. Maybe, Lysera said, or maybe I'm willing to learn from my mistakes instead of doubling down on them. Valor's hand moved to his sword, not drawing it, just resting there, a reminder. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to walk back out into that courtyard. You're going to tell your followers that the Unchained is finished, that Marin was working for me the whole time, that everything they believed was a lie. And then you're going to publicly submit, kneel, swear loyalty, become exactly what I tried to make you 18 months ago. And if I don't, then Marin's family dies slowly, and I release her to live with that knowledge. And then I hunt down every single person who ever helped you, and I make examples of them that will echo for generations. His eyes were cold as winter stone. I will burn the outer territories to bedrock, he said. I will salt the earth so nothing grows there for 100 years. And I will make sure everyone knows it was because of you, because you were too proud to bend. Lysera felt the walls closing in, not physical walls, but the narrowing of options until only impossible choices remained. This was power too, the kind that forced people to destroy themselves, that made them complicit in their own defeat. She could refuse, die with her principles intact, and watch everyone she cared about die with her. Or she could submit, save lives in the immediate term, and kill the idea that had given so many people hope. Both options were poison, both led to the same place, defeat. Unless she stopped playing the game by Valor's rules entirely. I have a counteroffer, she said. Valor raised an eyebrow. You're not in a position to negotiate. Hear me out, Lysera said, because I think you're going to like it. She moved closer, not threatening, just closing the distance. You want me to submit, she said, to publicly acknowledge your authority, to break the movement I've been building. Fine, I'll do it, all of it. But in exchange, you're going to reform the empire. Valor laughed. Excuse me? You heard me? You want to win? Really win? Then take what I've built and make it yours. Decentralize power, give settlements autonomy, reduce the taxes that are starving the outer territories, create councils where people have actual representation, turn the empire into something people choose to be part of instead of something they're forced to endure. You're insane. I'm practical, Lysera said, because here's what you're not seeing. If you crush me now, you prove everything I've been saying. You prove that your rule is based on force, and someone else will rise. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but eventually, and they'll use my martyrdom as fuel. You'll spend the rest of your life fighting brush fires you can't contain, and your solution is to just give up power? My solution is to share it, Lysera said. Make the empire something worth defending instead of something worth escaping. You get legitimacy, stability that doesn't require constant violence, and you get to be remembered as the king who evolved instead of the tyrant who fell. Valor stared at her. For a long moment, she thought she'd actually gotten through to him. Then he started laughing again. Longer this time, harder, like she'd just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Oh, you beautiful, naive girl, he said when he finally caught his breath. You really think power works that way? That I can just hand out autonomy and representation and everything will be fine? Power isn't something you share, it's something you hold. The moment you loosen your grip, it slips away. And I didn't spend my entire life building this empire just to watch it dissolve into democratic chaos. Then you're going to lose it, Lysera said quietly. Maybe not today, but soon. Because empires built on fear don't last. They just take longer to fall. Valor's expression went cold again. Kneel, he said, now, or I start killing people you care about until you do. Lysera looked at him, at the man who could have been her mate, who could have built something extraordinary if he'd just been willing to see people as partners instead of subjects. And she made a choice. Not the smart one. Not the strategic one. The human one. No, she said. Belor's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in something closer to respect. Then you're a fool, he said. Probably, Lysera agreed, but I'd rather die a fool than live as your puppet. Velor drew his sword, and Lysera stood unarmed in front of him, ready to die for the principle that some things mattered more than survival. The blade rose, hung in the air, and then a voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. Stop! Maren stood in the doorway, not alone. Behind her, weapons drawn, were the soldiers who'd been guarding the courtyard, but they weren't pointing their weapons at Lysera. They were pointing them at Velor. What is this? Velor demanded. Maren stepped forward, and her expression was carved from stone in fury. This is me making a choice, she said. For 18 months, I've been telling myself I had no options, that I had to protect my family no matter the cost. But you know what? I just realized something. My niece is 8 years old, and if she grows up in a world where men like you hold power, she's going to suffer anyway. Maybe not today, but eventually. So I'm done. I'm done choosing between bad options. I'm choosing a third path. She looked at Lysera. I'm choosing to fight. The soldiers behind her nodded. One of them, the same young guard who'd followed Lysera out of the capital a year ago, spoke up. We're tired, he said. Tired of following orders we don't believe in. Tired of hurting people who didn't do anything except refuse to submit. You told us once that we had a choice. Well, we're making it. Velor's face had gone white with rage. You're committing treason, he said. All of you. I will have you executed. Your families will be— My family is already dead, the young guard interrupted. You had them killed 6 months ago when my father spoke against your grain tax. I just didn't know it until I saw the reports. So you've got nothing to threaten me with anymore except death. And honestly, that's starting to look better than serving you. One by one, the other soldiers echoed the sentiment. Stories of abuse, of families destroyed, of orders that had torn them apart inside. And Lysera watched Velor's empire crumble not through invasion or rebellion, but through refusal, through people simply deciding they were done. Velor stood alone, sword still raised, and for the first time since Lysera had known him, he looked lost. This changes nothing, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I am still the Alpha King. I still command the Imperial Guard. The noble houses. The capital is already in revolt, Maren said quietly. Has been for the past 3 days. Word of what happened at Greystone spread faster than you thought. And when people heard that you were hunting down the woman who stood up to you, they started asking questions, started wondering why you were so afraid of one unarmed Omega. The noble houses are fracturing. Half of them are already negotiating with the Unchained for protection. The other half are trying to figure out which way to jump. Velor's sword lowered, not because he chose to, but because his arm seemed to forget why it was raised. You've lost, Lysera said softly. Not because we beat you, but because people stopped being afraid, and that's the only thing holding your empire together. For a long moment, Velor just stood there. Then he did something Lysera never expected. He dropped the sword. It clattered on the stone floor with a sound like finality. So what now? He asked, and his voice was hollow. You execute me? Put me on trial? Make an example? Lysera shook her head. No. You're going to do something harder. You're going to live, and you're going to watch the empire transform into something you don't recognize. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll learn that power isn't about domination. It's about service. Velor's laugh was bitter as ash. Service. From an Alpha King. From a man? Lysera corrected. The Alpha King died the moment you realized fear wasn't enough. What's left is just Velor Draxon, and he gets to decide who he wants to be next. Sec. The fortress at Blackridge became a strange kind of neutral ground over the next week. Representatives from the settlements arrived. Noble houses sent envoys. Even some of the Imperial Guard's upper command showed up to see if the rumors were true, that the Alpha King had abdicated, not formally, not with speeches or ceremony, but in the way that mattered. He'd stopped giving orders, and people had stopped taking them. Lysera found herself in the position she'd never wanted. Leader, not by choice, but by necessity. Because someone had to coordinate the chaos. Someone had to make sure the transition didn't collapse into violence, and somehow that someone had become her. Marin worked beside her, and between them they hammered out the framework of something new. Not an empire, not a pure democracy either, but a federation of settlements that maintained autonomy while coordinating on defense, trade, and resource sharing. It was messy. It was complicated. It was going to have 1,000 problems they hadn't foreseen, but it was theirs. Valor watched from the shadows, not participating, not interfering, just watching. And on the 7th day he approached Lysera alone. She was standing on the battlements, looking out over the valley, when she heard his footsteps. She didn't turn. "Come to give me advice?" she asked. "Would you take it?" "Probably not." Valor moved to stand beside her, keeping a careful distance. "For what it's worth," he said, "you were right, about most of it." "Most?" "I still think power requires hierarchy," he said, "that someone has to make final decisions. But maybe it doesn't have to be enforced through fear. Maybe there's a middle path I was too stubborn to see." Lysera glanced at him. "You're going to help us build it?" Valor shook his head. "No, I had my chance. I made my choices. This is your world now. I'm just trying to figure out how to exist in it without making things worse." "That's the most self-aware thing I've ever heard you say." Valor's mouth twitched, something that might have been a smile in another life. "Rejection does strange things to people," he said. "Turns out getting everything you believe turned inside out is a hell of an education." Lysera looked back out at the valley. "I didn't want this," she said quietly. "Any of it. I just wanted to be left alone. To build something small and safe." "But that's not how the world works," Valor said. "The moment you started showing people there was another way, you became responsible for what came next. That's the price of changing things. You don't get to control where it ends." Lysera felt the weight of that truth settle over her, because he was right. She'd set something in motion that was bigger than her now, bigger than any one person, and it would either grow into something extraordinary or collapse into something terrible, and she'd have to live with either outcome. "What will you do now?" she asked. Valor was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "For my whole life, I was the Alpha King. That's all I was. All I knew how to be. And now I'm just a man. With no purpose, no identity. I don't even know who Valor Draxon is without the crown." "Then maybe it's time to find out," Lysera said. She turned to face him fully. "You could help," she said, "not as a king, but as someone who understands how empires work, how power flows. We're going to make mistakes, a lot of them. And having someone who's already made those mistakes could save lives. You're offering me a position in your new government? I'm offering you a chance to be useful," Lysera said, "to take everything you learned ruling through fear and apply it to building something better. But only if you can accept that you're not in charge anymore, that you're just one voice among many." Valor studied her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't control or calculation. It was uncertainty, and strangely, it made him look more human. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's all I ask." He turned to leave, then paused. "Lysera?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry for what I did to you, for how I treated you. You deserved better." Lysera felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening. "We both did," she said. After he left, Lysera stood alone on the battlements and let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. The rejection, the exile, the rebuilding, the betrayal, the impossible choice. And now this, whatever this was, a new beginning. Or the start of a different kind of prison. She wouldn't know for years, maybe decades. But for the first time since standing in that throne room 18 months ago, Lysera felt something other than anger or determination. She felt hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. And in a world built on fear and domination, hope was the most dangerous weapon of all. Because hope made people believe they deserved better. And once people believed that, truly believed it, nothing could make them go back to accepting less. Not even the threat of destruction, not even death. Because some things, Lysera had learned, were worth dying for. And freedom, messy and complicated and terrifying as it was, topped that list. She looked out over the valley where the first settlements of the new federation were already taking shape. Imperfect, struggling, alive. And she made herself a promise. She would protect this, not through force, not through control, but through the constant, exhausting work of showing people that cooperation served them better than domination, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, because that was what separated builders from conquerors. Conquerors took the easy path. Builders chose the harder one. And Lysera, standing on the edge of a world she'd helped break and now had to rebuild, chose to be a builder, even if it killed her, even if she failed, even if the weight of it crushed her into the ground. She would try. And trying, she was beginning to understand, was all anyone could do. The rest was just fate and stubbornness and the hope that somewhere down the line, the choices you made today would matter tomorrow. She turned and walked back inside. There was work to do, always work to do. And for the first time in her life, Lysera was ready for it. Not because she wanted to be a leader, but because someone had to be. And she'd rather it be someone who understood what it felt like to have everything taken away, who knew the cost of power, who would never forget that every person she led was human, flawed, complicated, deserving of more than just survival. The empire was dead. Long live whatever came next. The peace lasted 3 months. 3 months of Lysera learning that building was infinitely harder than destroying. 3 months of mediation between settlements that had hated each other for generations. 3 months of trying to convince people that cooperation wasn't weakness, while simultaneously preparing for the moment when the old empire struck back. Because it would strike back. Empires didn't die quietly. They thrashed, they clawed, they pulled everything down with them on the way out. And Valor's empire, wounded and fracturing, was no different. The attack came at dawn, not on Blackridge, on the settlements themselves, coordinated, surgical, devastating. 3 territories hit simultaneously by what remained of the Imperial Guard, the ones who'd refused to defect, who still believed in the old ways, who saw the new federation as an abomination that needed to be cauterized before it spread. Lysera got the news from 3 different runners within an hour of each other, each one bloodied and gasping, each one carrying the same message. They're burning everything. She stood in what had become the war room, a space that used to be a barracks and now held maps and reports and the constant traffic of people trying to hold a fragile alliance together. Marin was already moving, pulling maps, marking locations. "How many?" she asked the first runner. 200 in the south. Maybe more. They hit at first light, killed anyone who resisted, took prisoners, set fire to the grain stores. The second runner, a woman with a gash across her forehead still bleeding, added her piece. 300 in the eastern settlements. They're not just attacking, they're occupying, planting imperial banners, declaring martial law. And the third runner, youngest of them all, barely 16, his voice shaking. "They took my sister. Took everyone under 20, said they were hostages, said if we resist, they start executing them one by one." Lysera felt ice flood her veins. This wasn't war, this was terrorism. And it was designed to do exactly one thing, force her to react emotionally instead of strategically, make her abandon the principles she'd been preaching and respond with the same brutality the Empire had always used. Because if she did that, she proved them right. Proved that the Federation was just another power structure wearing a prettier mask. But if she didn't respond, if she let them massacre her people, she proved she was too weak to protect what she'd built. No good options, just degrees of failure. This is what real leadership feels like, she thought bitterly. Not the speeches or the grand visions, the impossible calculations where every choice costs lives and you have to pick which lives matter more. "Where are they now?" she asked. The runners gave coordinates. Lysera marked them on the map, and the pattern became clear. They weren't random targets, they were supply routes. The 3 settlements hit were the ones responsible for feeding the rest of the Federation. Take them out, and within a month, people would be starving. And starving people didn't care about principles. They cared about survival. Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing. "We need to mobilize," Marin said. "Hit them hard and fast before they dig in." Lysera shook her head. "That's what they want. They're baiting us into a conventional fight. Somewhere they have the advantage." "So what do we do?" Marin demanded. "Just let them burn our people?" "No," Lysera said. "We do what we've always done. We outthink them." She studied the map, her mind racing through scenarios, discarding most of them immediately. Then she saw it. The pattern within the pattern. "They hit 3 settlements," she said slowly. "But they left the roads between them undefended. They're expecting us to come from Blackridge, to mass our forces and march in like an army." "So we don't march," Marin said, catching on. "We infiltrate. Lysera nodded. Small teams. Fast. We use the local populations as force multipliers. They know the terrain. They know which families can be trusted. We organize resistance from within while hitting their supply lines from outside. Make it too expensive to hold the territories. It'll take time, Marin warned. People will die while we organize. People are already dying, Lysera said. The question is whether we let their deaths be meaningless or whether we use them to build something that lasts. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Because that's what leadership required, turning tragedy into strategy, using suffering as leverage. It made her sick, but refusing to do it would make her useless. And useless leaders got everyone killed. Marin started barking orders, pulling together teams, coordinating with the runners who'd serve as communication links. Lysera stood at the map and felt the weight of every decision pressing down on her shoulders like physical mass. 3 months ago, she'd promised herself she'd be different, that she'd lead through cooperation instead of control. And now she was doing exactly what Valor would have done, calculating casualties, sacrificing the few to save the many, playing the same brutal game she'd sworn to end. The difference, she told herself, was that she hated it, that she'd never forget the cost. But was that enough? Or was she just lying to herself to make the choices bearable? She didn't know. And that uncertainty was going to eat her alive. The infiltration teams moved out within hours. Lysera led one of them personally. Marin had argued against it, said she was too valuable to risk, but Lysera shut that down immediately. I'm not asking people to do something I won't do myself, she'd said. That's how you lose trust. So she rode south with 10 others, all of them experienced fighters who'd survived the outer territories long enough to know how to move without being seen. They traveled through the night using game trails and dry riverbeds, avoiding the main roads where Imperial patrols would be waiting. By the second day, they were close enough to see the smoke. The settlement was called Ashford. Ironic name, given that half of it was currently burning. Lysera and her team watched from a ridge overlooking the valley, counting soldiers, mapping patrol patterns, looking for weaknesses. There were more than the runner had reported, at least 300, maybe closer to 4, all wearing Imperial colors, all moving with the kind of discipline that spoke to proper military training. This wasn't just the remnants of a broken empire. This was organized, funded. Someone with resources was backing this. Who? Lysera wondered. Which noble house decided the Federation was enough of a threat to risk open warfare? She'd find out eventually. Right now, it didn't matter. Right now, she needed to break this occupation before it became permanent. One of her team, a scarred woman named Delka, who'd been fighting since before Lysera was born, pointed to the center of the settlement. They've got the hostages penned there. 20, maybe 30, mostly young. They're using them as bait. To draw us in, Lysera said. Delka nodded. Classic trap. We go for the hostages. They collapse on us from 3 sides. We're dead before we get halfway there. So we don't go for the hostages, Lysera said. Not directly. Then what? We make them let the hostages go. Delka gave her a skeptical look. And how exactly do we do that? Lysera pointed to the grain stores on the edge of the settlement, currently guarded by a dozen soldiers. We burn their supplies, she said. Force them to choose between holding prisoners and feeding their troops. They can't do both. And when they make the wrong choice, we exploit it. That's cold, Delka said. Lysera met her eyes. You have a better option? Delka shook her head. Just making sure you know what you're becoming. The words hit harder than they should have, because Delka was right. This was cold, calculated. The kind of decision Valor would have made without hesitation, and Lysera was making it too. The only difference was that it made her feel like she was hollowing herself out one choice at a time. But feeling bad about it didn't change the math, didn't save lives, didn't make her less responsible for the consequences. It just meant she'd carry the weight of it afterward. And maybe that was the real price of leadership. Not the decisions themselves, but living with them. They moved at midnight. 4 of them, Lysera included, slipping through the outer perimeter while the rest created a diversion on the opposite side of the settlement. The guards at the grain stores were alert but focused outward, watching for threats from the surrounding hills. They weren't expecting someone to come from inside the settlement itself. Lysera moved like a shadow, using the techniques Marin had drilled into her months ago, techniques that felt like another lifetime now. Stay low, control your breathing, move when they move. The first guard went down without a sound, Delka's blade across his throat before he could cry out. The second turned at the noise, saw them, opened his mouth to shout. Lysera's knife found his throat first. She felt the hot spray of blood across her hands and fought down the nausea that tried to rise. No time for weakness. No space for humanity. Just the mission. Just survival. They torched the grain stores fast, using oil they'd brought in bladders, spreading it across the stockpiles before lighting it. The flames caught immediately, roaring to life with a hunger that seemed almost alive. By the time the alarm bells started ringing, Lysera and her team were already gone, melting back into the chaos of the settlement as soldiers rushed to contain the fire. And just like she'd predicted, they had to make a choice: guard the hostages or save the grain. They chose the grain because soldiers could find more hostages, but without food, they'd starve in a week. Lysera watched from a rooftop as the guards left their positions, rushing toward the flames, leaving only a skeleton crew behind. Now she signaled to Delka. They hit the remaining guards hard and fast, overwhelming them through speed and surprise. The hostages, terrified and confused, scattered the moment the pen opened. Lysera grabbed the youngest, the runner's sister, and shoved her toward the edge of the settlement. "Run," she hissed. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." The girl ran. They all did. And Lysera and her team covered their escape, fighting a running battle through smoke and fire, and the screams of soldiers realizing they'd been outmaneuvered. One of her team went down, an arrow through the shoulder. Another took a sword cut across the ribs. But they made it out, bleeding, exhausted, alive. And behind them, Ashford burned, the Imperial occupation collapsing into chaos as the commanders tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. Lysera led her team back to the ridge, back to the rendezvous point, and collapsed against a tree. Her hands were shaking, covered in blood that wasn't hers, or maybe some of it was. She couldn't tell anymore. Delka sat beside her, pressing a cloth against her own wound. "That was brutal," she said. Lysera nodded. "Yeah, you all right?" "No?" Delka's laugh was bitter. "Good. The day you stop feeling it is the day you become what we're fighting against." Lysera closed her eyes, trying to slow her racing heart, trying to breathe through the adrenaline crash. And she thought about Valor, about how many times he must have made these same calculations. How many times he'd sacrificed lives to save lives. How many times he'd felt this same hollowness afterward. And she wondered if that's what had broken him. Not the power itself, but the slow erosion of his humanity every time he chose pragmatism over principle. "I understand you now," she thought, "and I hate that I do." The pattern repeated itself across all three settlements over the next week. Small teams, fast strikes, guerrilla tactics designed to make occupation impossible. And it worked. The Imperial forces, expecting conventional warfare, couldn't adapt fast enough. They'd been trained to fight armies, not shadows. Within 10 days, they'd withdrawn from 2 of the 3 settlements, consolidating their forces in the third to make a stand, which was exactly what Lysera wanted. Because a concentrated force was easier to surround, easier to isolate, easier to destroy. Marin coordinated the siege, bringing in forces from across the Federation, surrounding the settlement on all sides while cutting off supply lines. They didn't attack, they just waited. And slowly, methodically, the Imperial forces inside began to starve. Some tried to break out. They were cut down. Some tried to negotiate. Lysera refused, because here's what she'd learned about power. Mercy was a luxury you could only afford when you'd already won, and she hadn't won yet. So she hardened herself against the pleas, against the suffering she could see even from a distance, and she waited. Until finally, on the 16th day, the white flags rose. Surrender. Unconditional. Total. Lysera rode into the settlement with Marin at her side and found the Imperial commander waiting in the square. He was older than she expected, weathered, with eyes that had seen too many battles. When he looked at her, there was no hatred, just exhaustion. "You won," he said simply. "What now?" Lysera studied him and realized she had to make another choice. Execute him as an example. Imprison him and risk him becoming a rallying point. Or let him go and show that the Federation was different, that it could be merciful even in victory. All three options had consequences. All three could backfire. But only one aligned with what she'd been trying to build, even if it might destroy her. "You go home," she said. "You and your soldiers. No reprisals, no trials. Just go home and tell whoever sent you that this is over. The Empire is dead, and anyone who tries to resurrect it will face the same response." The commander's eyes widened. "You're letting us live?" "I'm letting you choose," Lysera corrected. "You can go home, or you can keep fighting and die. But if you leave your weapons. You leave your banners, and you never come back." The commander stared at her for a long moment. Then he unbuckled his sword and dropped it to the ground. "We're done," he said. "We'll go." Behind him, his soldiers did the same. Weapons clattered on stone like rain, and Lysera felt something shift in the air. Not victory, not yet, but the beginning of it. The celebration that night was muted. People were too exhausted to truly rejoice. Too many had died. Too much had been destroyed. But they'd survived. And survival, Lysera was learning, was its own kind of victory. She found Valor standing apart from the others, watching the fires with an expression she couldn't read. She approached slowly, carefully. "You did well," he said, without looking at her. "We got lucky," Lysera corrected. "Luck is what people call good planning when they don't want to admit they were outmaneuvered." Lysera almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Valor spoke again. "You let them go. The Imperial forces." "Yes." "Why?" Lysera considered the question. "Because killing them would have made us exactly what we're trying not to be," she said. "And because I want people to understand that the Federation isn't about domination. It's about choice, even for our enemies." "Noble," Valor said, "and strategically questionable. Some of those soldiers will reorganize. Come at you again?" "Maybe," Lysera admitted. "But at least they'll know we gave them a chance. And that matters." "Does it?" "I have to believe it does," Lysera said. "Because if it doesn't, then what are we even building?" Valor finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Respect. Real respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement of a defeated enemy, but the recognition of an equal. "You're going to change the world," he said quietly. "Or die trying." "Probably both," Lysera said. Valor's mouth twitched. "Probably." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad I was wrong about you." Lysera watched him walk away and felt the weight of those words settle over her, because Valor had been wrong. She wasn't weak, wasn't deficient, wasn't unworthy. She was exactly what she needed to be. Flawed, uncertain, terrified most of the time, but willing to make the hard choices, willing to carry the weight, willing to keep trying even when failure seemed inevitable. And that, she was beginning to understand, was what real strength looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make your choices for you. 6. The messenger arrived 3 days later. Lysera was in the middle of a council meeting when the runner burst through the door, gasping for air. "Attack," he managed. "Capital. Now." The room went silent. Marin was on her feet instantly. Details, full assault, every noble house that still supports the old empire. They've united, calling themselves the Restoration. They're marching on the capital with everything they have. "How many?" The runner's face was pale. 5,000, maybe more. 5,000. Against the maybe 2,000 fighters the Federation could muster if they stripped every settlement of defenders. And that was assuming they could get there in time. This was it. The final confrontation. Win or lose. Survive or burn. Lysera looked around the table at faces she'd come to know over the past months. People who'd believed in her, trusted her, followed her into the unknown. And she knew what she had to do. "We march," she said. "All of us. Every fighter we have. We meet them at the capital and we end this." "That's suicide," one of the council members said. "They outnumber us more than 2 to 1. "Then we'll have to be smarter," Lysera said. "We've done it before. We'll do it again." "And if we lose?" Lysera's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then we lose fighting for something worth dying for. And that's more than the Empire can say. The council erupted into argument. Plans, objections, fear masquerading as pragmatism. But Lysera tuned it out, because she'd already made the decision. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The point where principle met reality, and one of them had to break. And Lysera had spent too long building this to watch it crumble without a fight. She looked at Marin. How fast can we mobilize? 12 hours, Marin said. Maybe less. Then we move at dawn. Marin's grin was feral. Damn right we do. The army assembled in darkness. Not an army, really, just people. Farmers and merchants and outcasts and rogues. People who'd been told their entire lives they didn't matter. That they were too weak, too unimportant, too broken to make a difference. And they'd chosen to prove that wrong. Lysera stood before them, mounted on a horse she barely knew how to ride, and tried to find words that would matter, that would give them courage for what was coming. But words felt inadequate, cheap, compared to what they were about to face. So she kept it simple. We're marching on the capital, she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Not to conquer it, not to rule it, but to defend what we've built. To show everyone watching that the Federation isn't just an idea, it's a reality, and realities don't die easy. She paused. I won't lie to you, a lot of us won't make it back. The odds are against us. The forces we're facing are larger, better equipped, better trained. By every metric, we should lose. But here's what they don't understand. Here's what every empire throughout history has failed to grasp. People fighting for their freedom are more dangerous than soldiers fighting for a paycheck. Because we're not fighting to win. We're fighting because losing isn't an option. Because going back to the way things were would be worse than death. And that makes us ungovernable, unkillable, unstoppable. The crowd roared, not with joy, with rage, with defiance, with the sound of people who'd been beaten down their entire lives finally deciding they'd had enough. And Lysera felt that sound vibrate through her chest like thunder, felt the weight of their belief, their trust, their hope. She raised her fist. For the Federation, she shouted. The army echoed it back. For the Federation, for the Federation, for the Federation. And as the sun broke over the horizon, they marched toward the capital, toward the final battle, toward whatever waited on the other side. Lysera rode at the front, Marin beside her, and tried not to think about how many of the people behind her wouldn't survive the day. Tried not to calculate the odds. Tried not to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. Because doubt was poison. And she couldn't afford poison. Not now. Not when everything depended on her ability to project certainty, even when she felt none. So she buried the fear, locked it away, and became the leader they needed her to be. Even if it was killing her, even if she was terrified, even if every instinct screamed at her to run. She rode toward the capital, and the Empire's last stand, and prayed to God she didn't believe in that she was making the right choice. Okay, they saw the smoke before they saw the city, black columns rising into the sky like pillars holding up the heavens. The Restoration had already begun their assault. The capital was burning. Lysera pushed her horse faster, her heart hammering against her ribs. If they were too late, if the city had already fallen. But as they crested the final ridge, she saw them. Two armies facing each other across the plains outside the capital walls. The Restoration forces, massive and organized, banners flying, armor gleaming in the morning light. And defending the city, impossibly, was a force of maybe 1,000. Civilians, mostly. People who'd stayed when the Empire collapsed. People who'd chosen to defend what remained rather than flee. And at their head, standing alone in front of the gates, was Violor. No armor, no crown. Just a man with a sword. Facing an army. Lysera's breath caught, because she understood what he was doing. He was buying time, drawing the Restoration's attention, giving people inside the city a chance to evacuate. He was sacrificing himself. And he knew it. The Restoration commander, a noble Lysera didn't recognize, shouted something across the field. Valor's response was inaudible from this distance, but the body language was clear. He was refusing to surrender. The Restoration forces began to advance. Lysera kicked her horse into a gallop. "Hold!" she screamed to her forces. "Wait for my signal!" She thundered down the slope alone, racing toward Valor, toward the closing jaws of the trap. And as she rode, she realized something. This was it. The moment everything hinged on. Not the battle itself, but the choice. Stand with Valor, stand with the man who'd rejected her, who'd tried to destroy her, who'd embodied everything she'd spent 18 months fighting against. Or let him die. Let the restoration crush him. Let the old empire's last symbol fall and build something new on the ashes. Both options were defensible. Both had logic behind them. But only one felt right. Because Valor had changed, had tried, had stood here alone knowing he was going to die rather than let innocent people burn. And that deserved something, even if it was suicidal, even if it cost everything. She reached him just as the restoration forces closed to within 100 yards. Valor turned, saw her, and his eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Saving your stupid ass," Lysera said, pulling her horse to a stop beside him. "What does it look like?" "I told you to build something better," Valor said, not throw it away on a futile gesture. "Nothing is futile if it means something," Lysera shot back. She looked at the advancing army, at the impossible odds, at the death rushing toward them. And she smiled. "Besides," she said, "you don't get to die a martyr. That's my job." Valor stared at her. Then he started laughing. Not bitter, not defeated, just genuinely amused. "You're completely insane," he said. "Yeah," Lysera agreed. "I really am." She raised her hand. Behind her, on the ridge, her forces waited. 2,000 against 5,000. Terrible odds. But not impossible. Not if they fought smart. Not if they fought together. She looked at Valor one last time. "You ready for this?" "No," he admitted. "But I'm done running." "Good," Lysera said. She dropped her hand. And her army charged, screaming defiance into the face of annihilation, racing toward the restoration forces with everything they had. And as the two armies collided in a crash of metal and fury and desperate hope, Lysera raised her sword and dove into the chaos. Knowing this was the end. One way or another, win or lose, live or die. This was where everything she'd built either proved itself or shattered. And there was no going back. Only forward. Into the fire, into the unknown, into whatever came next. The first thing Lysera learned about real combat was that it wasn't glorious. It was chaos wrapped in terror and drenched in blood. The second thing she learned was that survival wasn't about skill. It was about luck and stubbornness, and the refusal to lie down even when your body begged you to. She fought beside Valor in the center of the maelstrom, their backs pressed together as the restoration forces crashed against them like waves trying to drown stone. Her sword arm burned. Her lungs screamed for air. Blood, hers and others, slicked her hands until she could barely grip her weapon. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant dying, and dying meant everyone who'd believed in her had been wrong. Around them, the battle unfolded in brutal fragments. Marin leading a flanking charge that carved through the Restoration's left wing. The young guard from the capital, the one who'd questioned his orders a lifetime ago, fighting with the kind of desperate fury that comes from finally finding something worth protecting. Delka, scarred and vicious, moving through enemies like a force of nature, and everywhere people falling. Friends, allies. Faces Lysera had come to know over months of building this impossible dream. Gone. Just gone. The weight of their deaths pressed against her chest with every breath, threatening to crush her, but she swallowed the grief and kept moving. Grief was a luxury for after, if there was an after. The Restoration commander, a noble named Corvin who'd built his fortune on the Empire's cruelty, pushed through the lines toward Lysera and Valor with a wedge of elite guards. His face was twisted with rage and righteous fury. "Traitors!" he screamed over the din of battle. "Both of you, you destroyed everything we built." Valor parried a strike meant for Lysera's head and shouted back, "We destroyed a prison and called it liberation. You just can't see the difference." Corvin's blade came down in a vicious arc. Valor caught it on his sword, the impact driving him to one knee. Lysera moved without thinking, her blade finding the gap in Corvin's armor, sliding between ribs, finding something vital. Corvin's eyes went wide. He looked down at the steel buried in his chest, then up at Lysera. "You!" he gasped. "You were nothing. Nobody." Lysera twisted the blade, felt him shudder. felt the life drain out of him. "I still am," she said quietly. "That's what you never understood. Power doesn't come from being somebody. It comes from refusing to be nothing." Corvin fell, and with him, the heart of the Restoration's command. Lysera watched him die and felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the cold, hollow certainty that this was what leadership cost. Your humanity, one piece at a time, until you weren't sure what was left. The battle raged for 3 more hours, 3 hours of brutal, grinding attrition where neither side could gain ground and both just bled each other dry. But slowly, impossibly, the Restoration forces began to falter. Not because they were weaker, but because they were fighting for an idea that had already died. They were trying to resurrect a corpse. And corpses, no matter how desperately you clung to them, didn't come back to life. The Federation forces, outnumbered and outmatched, fought with the kind of ferocity that comes from defending something you helped build, something you chose, something that saw you as human instead of expendable. And that difference, small as it seemed, was everything. Because when the Restoration soldiers looked around and saw their commanders falling, saw the empire they were fighting for crumbling in real time, they had to ask themselves a question. What are we dying for? And more of them couldn't find an answer. Weapons began to drop. Hands began to rise. Surrender rippled through the Restoration lines like a contagion. And by sunset, when the light turned the blood-soaked field into something almost beautiful, it was over. The Restoration had fallen. The Empire was truly, finally, dead. Lysera stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the broken bodies of people who'd believed different things, fought for different futures, and paid the same price. Death didn't discriminate. It didn't care about your ideology. It just took and took and took until nothing was left. Valor limped toward her, a gash across his forehead bleeding into his eyes. "We won," he said. "Did we?" Lysera asked, looking at the carnage. "We're alive," Valor said. "That's more than most can say." Lysera's laugh was bitter. "Is that the bar now? Survival? What else is there?" She wanted to answer, wanted to say something about meaning and purpose and building a better world. But the words stuck in her throat because right now, covered in blood and surrounded by death, those concepts felt impossibly distant. Right now, she just felt tired. Tired and hollowed out and wondering if any of this had been worth it. The capital opened its gates at dawn, not in surrender, in welcome. The people who'd stayed, who'd defended the city alongside Valor, emerged to see who'd won, and when they saw the Federation forces battered and bloodied but standing, something rippled through the crowd. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. Lysera walked through the gates on foot, her horse lost somewhere in the battle, and felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. They were looking for a leader, for someone to tell them what came next, for certainty in a world that had just been turned inside out, and she had nothing to give them except honesty. "The Empire is gone," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "Not because we destroyed it, but because it destroyed itself, because it built itself on fear and control and the belief that some people mattered more than others. And that foundation was always going to crumble eventually." She paused, gathering her thoughts, trying to find words that weren't empty. What we build in its place won't be perfect. It'll be messy and complicated, and there will be days when you wonder if the old way was easier. But here's the difference. What we're building is yours, not mine, not anyone's. It belongs to all of us. And that means all of us have to protect it. All of us have to work for it. All of us have to choose it every single day. A voice from the crowd called out, "What if we choose wrong?" "Then we fix it," Lysera said. "Together. That's what makes this different. Mistakes aren't final. They're just opportunities to do better." She looked around at the faces watching her, some skeptical, some hopeful, some just exhausted. "I won't lie to you," she said. "This is going to be hard. Harder than anything we've done so far. Building is always harder than destroying, but I've spent the last 18 months learning something important. People are stronger than we give them credit for. And when you give them a choice, when you trust them to make decisions about their own lives, they usually choose better than any ruler could choose for them." Another voice, Older this time. And if they don't? Then we deal with the consequences, Lysera said. Together. Because that's what community means. Not perfection. Just people trying to take care of each other. And sometimes failing. And trying again anyway. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. Slow at first. Then others joined. Not a roar, not celebration. Just acknowledgement. Of the truth. Of the difficulty. Of the choice they were all making together. Lysera felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, letting out the grief and fear and exhaustion she'd been holding in. She didn't cry, not in front of them, but it was close. Mamutas tamak. The reconstruction took months. Months of mediation and rebuilding and learning how to govern without hierarchy. It was messy. People argued, disagreed, fought over resources and priorities and whose needs mattered more, but they didn't kill each other. They talked. They compromised. They found solutions that weren't perfect but were good enough. And slowly, painfully, something new began to take shape. Not an empire. A federation in the truest sense, where settlements maintained autonomy but coordinated on defense and trade, where councils made decisions collectively instead of one person dictating from above, where mistakes were acknowledged and fixed instead of buried. It wasn't paradise, but it was functional. And functional, Lysera was learning, was a kind of miracle. Valor helped, not as a leader, but as an advisor, someone who understood the mechanics of power and could warn against the pitfalls. He and Lysera developed a strange kind of partnership, not friendship exactly, but mutual respect built on shared trauma and the understanding that they'd both been broken and rebuilt by the same forces. One evening, 6 months after the battle, they sat on the battlements of Black Ridge, watching the sun set over the territories they'd fought for. "Do you regret it?" Valor asked. "Everything you gave up to build this?" Lysera considered the question. "I gave up nothing," she said finally. "I lost things. But I didn't give them up. They were taken. And what I built in their place is mine in a way the old life never was." Valor nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand that." "Are you?" He smiled, faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just too tired to fight anymore." "There's dignity in that too," Lysera said, "knowing when to stop." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Valor spoke again. "I'm sorry. For what I did to you. For how I treated you. You deserved better." Lysera looked at him. At the man who'd rejected her, who'd tried to erase her, who taught her more about power through his failures than he ever could have through success. "I know," she said, "and I've forgiven you, not because you earned it, but because holding on to anger was costing me more than it was worth." Valor's eyes glistened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," Lysera said. "Just do better. That's all any of us can do." Marin found her later that night, standing alone in the courtyard. "You all right?" she asked. Lysera shrugged. "Define all right?" "Still breathing, not actively bleeding, relatively sane." "Then I guess I am," Lysera said. Marin moved to stand beside her, and for a moment they just existed in the quiet. Then Marin spoke. "I never apologized for what I did, for selling you out. You were protecting your family," Lysera said. "I would have done the same. That doesn't make it okay." "No?" Lysera agreed. "But it makes it human. And human is all any of us can be." Marin's throat worked. "My niece asked about you, the one they tortured. She wanted to know who the woman was that saved us." "What did you tell her?" Marin smiled. "I told her you were someone who understood that power isn't about being strong. It's about being willing to break and still keep going." Lysera felt tears prick her eyes. "That's a heavy burden to put on a kid." "She can handle it," Marin said. "She's tougher than she looks. Takes after her aunt." They both laughed, quiet and raw and genuine. And Lysera realized that this moment of connection with someone who'd betrayed her and been forgiven was what she'd been fighting for all along. Not grand ideals. Not perfect systems. Just the ability for people to be messy and complicated and human without being destroyed for it. A year after the battle, the Federation held its first collective council. Representatives from every settlement gathered in the capital to discuss trade agreements, defense coordination, and the thousand small decisions that kept a society functioning. Lysera attended, not as a leader, but as one voice among many. She'd stepped back from formal power months ago, recognizing that the Federation needed to prove it could function without her, that it wasn't just another cult of personality. It had been terrifying at first. Letting go, trusting others to carry the weight, but it had also been liberating, because leadership, she'd discovered, was a trap. The moment you became indispensable, you became the thing you'd been fighting against. A bottleneck, a single point of failure, a tyrant, even if a benevolent one. So she'd taught others, delegated, stepped aside when her presence was hindering instead of helping. And the Federation hadn't collapsed. It had grown, evolved, become something bigger than her, which was exactly what it needed to be. She watched the council debate resource allocation, listened to people argue passionately about priorities, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not happiness, exactly. She'd seen too much, lost too much, carried too much weight for simple happiness. But peace. The knowledge that she'd done what she set out to do, that she'd proven something important. That rejection hadn't destroyed her. It had refined her, turned her into something the Empire could never have created. Someone who understood that power was a tool, not an identity. That strength came from vulnerability, not invulnerability. That the willingness to break was what made you unbreakable. After the council adjourned, a young woman approached her, maybe 19, with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "Are you Lysera?" she asked. "Just Lysera now," Lysera said. "But yes." The young woman's hands twisted together nervously. "I was at the battle, a year ago. I saw you fight. Saw you stand with the former king, even though everyone said you should let him die. And I've been trying to understand why you'd risk everything for someone who hurt you." Lysera studied her, saw herself in those eyes. The confusion, the hurt, the desperate need for answers that made sense. "Because revenge is easy," she said finally, "and it's satisfying for about 5 minutes. But then it's done and you're still left with the hole inside you, the one that person created when they hurt you. And filling that hole with their pain doesn't work. It just makes the hole bigger. So what does work?" Lysera smiled, sadly. "Building something better. Not for them. For you. Proving to yourself that you're more than what they said you were. That rejection doesn't define you. It just reveals what was already there." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "I was rejected too," she whispered. "By my pack. They said I was too weak, too emotional, that I'd never survive. And yet here you are," Lysera said, "at a council meeting, participating in building a new world. Sounds like you survived just fine, but it still hurts." "It always will," Lysera said gently. "That's not weakness. That's proof you're human. The trick is learning to carry the pain without letting it carry you." "How do you do that?" "You just do," Lysera said. "One day at a time. One choice at a time. And some days you fail. Some days the pain wins. But you get up the next day and try again, and eventually the good days start to outnumber the bad ones." The young woman nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. She walked away, and Lysera watched her go, hoping her words had helped. Knowing they probably hadn't. Not really. Because some things you had to learn through living, not through being told. But maybe she'd planted a seed. Maybe years from now, that young woman would remember this conversation and it would mean something. That was all you could hope for, to leave small marks on people, to help where you could, to be honest about your failures, and to keep trying even when the trying seemed pointless. 2 years after the battle, Lysera left the capital. Not fleeing, not running, just choosing something different. She returned to Haven. The settlement where Kara had first found her collapsed under a dead tree. It had grown, expanded from a desperate collection of outcasts into a thriving community. Kara was still running it, though she threatened to retire every other week. When Lysera arrived, Kara took one look at her and grinned. "You look like shit," she said. "I feel like shit," Lysera admitted. "Good, means you're still alive. Dead people don't feel anything." They sat together in the shade, sharing a skin of something that burned pleasantly on the way down, and caught up. "You built something," Kara said after a while. "Something real." "We built something," Lysera corrected. All of us. Don't do that, Kara said. Don't minimize what you did. You walked into the Capitol unarmed and made a king blink. You survived betrayal, led an army against impossible odds, changed the entire structure of society. Own it. Lysera was quiet for a moment. I'm tired, Kara, she said finally. Tired of being a symbol. Tired of people looking to me for answers I don't have. I just want to be a person again. Kara nodded. Then be a person. That's allowed, you know. You did the hard part. You got the boulder rolling. Let other people push it for a while. Is it really that simple? No, Kara said. But it's necessary. You keep carrying the world, you'll collapse under the weight. And then who does that help? Lysera smiled. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You were just too busy being a revolutionary to notice. They laughed. And in that laughter, Lysera felt something shift. A release. Permission to stop. To rest. To just exist without the constant pressure to be more. She stayed in Haven for 6 months. Worked in the fields. Helped with construction. Mediated disputes when asked but otherwise stayed out of governance. And slowly, gradually, she began to remember who she was before rejection had forged her into something harder. She wasn't that soft girl anymore. Could never be that girl again. But she also wasn't just the revolutionary. The leader. The symbol. She was Lysera. Complex, contradictory, still figuring it out. And that was okay. Better than okay. It was human. 3 years after the battle, Valor found her in Haven. She was surprised to see him. He'd stayed in the capital, working with the council, and they'd maintained friendly distance. Not avoidance, just space. He looked different, older, more weathered, but also lighter somehow, like he'd put down a weight he'd been carrying his whole life. Can we talk? He asked. Lysera gestured to the bench beside her. Sure. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Valor spoke. I'm leaving, he said. The capital, the Federation, all of it. Lysera looked at him. Why? Because I've spent 3 years trying to help build something I fundamentally don't understand, he said. I get the mechanics, the logistics. But the philosophy? The idea that people can govern themselves without someone enforcing order? I believe it intellectually, but I don't feel it, and that makes me a liability. Where will you go? I don't know, Valor admitted. Somewhere quiet, where I can figure out who I am without the crown, without the empire. Just Valor. That sounds lonely. Probably, he said, but necessary. Lysera nodded. I understand. They sat together a while longer. Then Valor spoke again. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you hate me? For what I did? Lysera considered the question. Really considered it. No, she said finally. I don't hate you. I pity you sometimes. For how much you lost because you couldn't let go of control. But hate? That takes too much energy. And I'd rather spend that energy on something useful. Valor's smile was sad. You're a better person than I am. I'm just a different person, Lysera said. We both did terrible things, made terrible choices. The difference is, I learned from mine, and you're still learning from yours. Will I ever stop learning? He asked. Will it ever feel like I've atoned enough? Probably not, Lysera said honestly. That's the price of power. You don't get absolution. You just get the rest of your life to try to do better. Valor stood, extended his hand. Thank you, he said, for not letting me die a tyrant, for giving me the chance to be something else. Lysera took his hand, held it for a moment. Two people who'd been enemies, allies, and everything in between. Good luck, she said, with whatever comes next. You too, Valor said. He walked away. And Lysera watched him go, feeling neither sadness nor relief. Just closure, the final severing of a bond that had never formed but had shaped both of them anyway. Check. 5 years after the battle, Lysera attended the first Federation-wide gathering, not as a representative, as an observer. She stood in the back and watched settlements that had once been enemies negotiate trade agreements, watched councils debate peacefully instead of resorting to violence, watched people choose cooperation over domination. It wasn't perfect. There were still disputes, still inequalities, still people trying to accumulate power. But the structures existed to address those problems. And more importantly, people used them. They'd learned that working together served them better than fighting, that collaboration was more sustainable than conquest, that power shared was power multiplied. And standing there, watching it all unfold, Lysera felt something she'd never expected to feel. Gratitude. Not for the rejection. That had been brutal and unnecessary and had nearly destroyed her, but for what came after, for the person she'd become in response, for the strength she'd found in breaking, for the community she'd helped build from nothing. Because here was the truth about rejection that no one told you. It didn't have to be the end. It could be the beginning, not of revenge, not of bitterness, but of transformation, of becoming someone who didn't need approval to know their worth, who didn't need dominance to feel powerful, who understood that the greatest strength was the willingness to be vulnerable and keep trying anyway. Rejection had stripped her of everything she thought defined her, and in doing so, it had given her the freedom to choose who she wanted to be. Not an Omega, not a revolutionary, just Lysera, flawed, complicated, human. And enough, always enough. She slipped out of the gathering quietly, unnoticed, and walked back to Haven under a sky full of stars. The journey had been brutal. The cost had been high. But she'd survived. More than survived. She'd built something that would outlast her. Something that proved rejection wasn't an ending, just a redirection towards something better. And as she walked through the settlement she'd helped create, greeting people by name, stopping to help someone struggling with firewood, listening to children laugh in the distance, Lysera realized something profound. She was happy, not in spite of everything that had happened, but because of it. Because pain had taught her resilience, betrayal had taught her discernment, loss had taught her what really mattered, and rejection had taught her that her worth was inherent, not given by others, not dependent on acceptance, just there, unshakable, eternal. She reached her small home, nothing fancy, just a place to rest, and sat on the porch watching the stars. And she thought about the girl who'd stood in that throne room 5 years ago, desperate for approval, broken by rejection, certain her life was over. If she could go back, what would she say to that girl? She'd say this: "You are going to survive this. It won't feel like it. There will be days when you want to give up, when the pain feels too big to carry, when you're certain you'll never be whole again. But you will. Not the same whole. Something different, something stronger, something that doesn't need a king to tell you you're worthy. You'll learn that power isn't something you're given. It's something you claim, not through force, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to disappear, of standing up every time you're knocked down, of building when others destroy, of choosing hope when despair would be easier. It's going to be hard, harder than anything you can imagine, but you're going to make it. And when you do, you're going to look back and realize that rejection wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to you. It was the best, because it freed you to become who you were always meant to be. Not his queen, not anyone's, just yourself. And that in the end is the only crown worth wearing. Lysera smiled and let the past go. 5 years of carrying it was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, new reasons to keep fighting. But tonight, she was at peace. A woman who'd been erased and had rewritten herself. A leader who'd learned to step back. A survivor who'd transformed pain into purpose. And standing alone under the stars, Lysera understood the final truth about power. It wasn't about domination. It wasn't about control. It was about choice. The choice to keep going when everything said to stop. The choice to build when destruction was easier. The choice to be kind when cruelty would be justified. The choice to evolve instead of calcify. And she'd made those choices. Every single day. Even when they hurt. Especially when they hurt. Because that's what separated those who changed the world from those who complained about it. Not strength, not talent, just the stubborn, relentless refusal to accept that this was all there was. The belief that something better was possible, and the willingness to bleed for it. Lysera stood, stretched, and walked inside to rest. Tomorrow she'd wake up and face whatever came next. But tonight, she was enough. Exactly as she was. Rejected, rebuilt, unbreakable. And finally free.